Resident Evil is one of the most formative gaming franchises for me, right alongside other major pillars of my early gaming diet, like Final Fantasy, Mortal Kombat, and Spyro. Starting out, I just watched my father and eldest brother play the games, but eventually, I started playing the games for myself. While I haven't played literally every single game in the franchise, I have played all of the mainline titles, their remakes, a smattering of the premiere spin-offs, and watched 3 of the films. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and today I'm sharing my ranking of every Resident Evil game I've played, and I'll also be including the first 3 films that I've watched. Requiem will also be on this list, so if you want to avoid spoilers for that, check the chapters below and skip over accordingly. With all of that established, let's dive right in. Number 21. This list is titled worst to best for a reason. I'd say that the vast majority of Resident Evil things vary from good to god tier, but Extinction is one of the truly dreadful things to come out of this series. The whole reason I never watched any film, including the animated ones, after this is because of just how far Extinction moves beyond the range of Resident Evil's core identity. Now, I'm perfectly fine with film adaptations not being one-to-one in their recreation of a game's story, characters, and ideas. However, it should be somewhat close. This is what made 1995's Mortal Kombat such an important film in the adaptation realm, and as I'll discuss more later, the first and second film, while campy, are still close enough to the game's identity to make their differences forgivable. It'd be okay for even the films to receive a tonal shift, as the game series was already heading towards its primarily action horror era, but Extinction is just all over the place. Firstly, the world becoming a desert hellscape doesn't leave any room open for the introduction of additional sequels or a believable basis for the survival of humanity. This would be fine if this were to be the final film from its inception, but it baits a sequel at the ending with that clone army trope that has never ever been good. Rewatching Extinction for this ranking did leave me with some positive realizations though. There are genuinely a handful of interesting or otherwise cool scenes, and I particularly enjoy Ian Glenn's performance, and I'm not shocked at all that he would go on to play an excellent Jorah Mormont in Game of Thrones after this performance. Lyndon Ashby, Johnny Cage in the 95 MK movie, is also in Extinction, and while he doesn't have a ton of lines, he's a nice addition to the cast. In terms of scenes, I enjoy the failed zombie domestication moment, most of the action sequences, and the final resolution of the story where Glenn's character is chopped into pieces by a laser grid. Many of these moments are hokey, but that sort of campy action is not a bad thing in my book. It's just that these elements don't make up for the truly dreadful aspects of the movie, such as how Claire Redfield, Carlos, and Wesker are portrayed and the way Alice's story and character is placed above them in terms of importance. The inclusion of an original character like Alice isn't a problem on its own, as an Outbreak style story in the RE universe could be cool, but OCs should never, ever, and not in any way be favored over iconic and series staple characters. This is the same sin 2021's Mortal Kombat commits as well, and likewise, it is a massive detriment to that film. Anyway, I could make a whole video just about the film adaptations of games, and may revisit this topic again should I ever make something like that. Number 20. Survivor is the worst RE game I've played, but I do have to say that there are elements of it that I actually think are pretty good. The way the development team was able to reuse zombie models from RE2 while also creating fully 3D environments within the framework of a console-intended light gun game is quite impressive. The issue is that the gun controller peripheral never actually came to North America because of Columbine, and playing something like this on a PS1 controller is about as terrible as you could expect. First-person shooters were not the PS1's forte, and while the console would have some standouts like Alien Resurrection, the vast majority of first-person games on the hardware were by and away inferior to the PC games coming out at the same time. Some crummy controls are forgivable if the overall design accounts for them, but unfortunately Survivor exhibits linear RE design well before audiences, or the designers themselves, were ever ready for such a thing. Even if it did come out after RE4 firmly established the series into the linear type of game design, the limited nature of Survivor's campaign, in conjunction with its terrible main protagonist would have precluded it from RE royalty. Number 19. Resident Evil 6 is a game that has gone through a bit of a discourse shift in recent years. The first time I heard someone say they actually kind of liked RE6 was back in 2017 or 18, but I wouldn't get around to the game myself until my friend Ryan and I played it together back in 2023. Clearly, I did not enjoy my time with the game, but I can see what people are saying in defense of it. Some parts of the game were kind of fun, such as the Sherry and Jake chapters, and some parts of Leon's campaign. However, the vast majority of the game is incredibly boring or outright poorly designed, with the major standout in this regard being Chris's section. The third-person cover shooter was a well-established genre within the 7th generation, yet somehow RE6's Chris parts managed to have some of the worst cover shooting design from the foundation of the controls I've ever experienced in my life. That being said, I never played the Mercenaries mode, which seems to be the thing defenders of the title mostly focus on, and this is where my empathy for RE6's fans comes from. Based on my experience with Sherry's parts, I can definitely see how a Mercenaries mode could be lots of fun, but this possible truth doesn't make up for the fact that RE6's campaigns, the main brunt of its content, are not fun, or worse, are even boring, more often than not. Even if this were the best individual mode in the franchise, that wouldn't be enough to save it for me. Number 18. Of the games I hope Capcom remakes the most, Zero is at the top of the list. There's some real potential for the core conceit of this game, especially the idea of a dual protagonist designed title. Requiem already showed us one way in which this sort of thing could work in the modern era, but Zero's open design is something that needs to be retained. The key thing that Zero does wrong is the inventory management between the two characters. With that element of its design overhauled, this game would have been a great spin-off prologue to the first RE game. As it stands, this is a game with great potential that is ultimately let down by a few baffling design decisions that derail it. Number 17. After my first playthrough of Village, I enjoyed roughly 50% of the game. House Beneviento, Heisenberg's factory, the final boss fight, and the Dragon Dimitrescu finale to the opening castle are all parts I enjoyed. However, House Beneviento is categorically worse upon replay, meaning that after 3 full playthroughs of Village, only a third of it is enjoyable for me. Other than RE6, that's the lowest percentage any of these games have ever impressed me, and it's for this reason, and the fact that weapons lack the oomph I expect from RE games, that Village is a game I only expect to go further down on the list with time. Zero is one I can see myself appreciating upon replay, and the heights RE6's mercenary mode apparently reaches means that whenever I remake this list after a few more RE games come out, I'm expecting it to be the bottom of the mainline series. This marks the last entry in this list that I ultimately dislike, as each entry past this is something I'd call at least good as a baseline. Number 16. Apocalypse has the same pitfall as Extinction with how it sidelines series staple characters, like Jill Valentine and Carlos in favor of Alice. But the excellent action sequences and character moments of this one outweigh this poor writing decision. One of the better action sequences just replicates the opening helicopter minigun moment from Code Veronica. Also, the Nemesis moments are all cool, and this time period of the franchise, the fall of Raccoon City, is the best, making the setting of this particular movie especially strong. That being said, Apocalypse is a film definitely designed around 90s cheese, which makes it stand apart from the typical films coming out in the 2000s, and as a film, it's fairly average at best. This doesn't stop it from being a fun romp, but it does bar it from being any higher up on this list. Number 15. Revelations 2 is a bit worse than the first title, however, it did come out during that time when game studios were trying to release these experimental episodic releases for games. Clearly, this is a game design ideal that did not hold up under scrutiny and eventually went the way of the dodo. Now it only exists within the industry as a component of free-to-play games. Revelations 2 takes the gameplay of the first title, expands it a bit without the hardware restrictions of the 3DS, and creates a solid survival horror experience centered on co-op play. Capcom's 7th generation was their low point for sure, and undoubtedly Admittedly, Revelations 2 was severely impacted by that. With a different company culture, Revelations 2 probably could have been something more, but it was too held back by that RE6 era of design, something that wouldn't change until after Japan's massive gaming comeback in 2017. Revelations 2 is a flawed title to be sure, but there's a lot that can be learned by looking at the failures of such an experimental game. The idea they were going for, where one player is the action hero and one is a horrified survivor, creates a cool dynamic, but it just didn't come together in this game. Co-op RE is a vibe though, so I hope they revisit this style of design again in the future. In fact, the dynamic that they created between Grace and Leon, where Grace has the horror campaign and Leon has the action hero style of design, is actually what Revelations 2 was going for, and is exactly what I meant in the Zero entry about Requiem giving me a sense of what co-op or dual protagonist Resident Evil design could look like. Looking at how you can switch between protags in Revelations 2 and Zero, and imagining what a follow-up to Requiem could do with that system by implementing it, either in a co-op or dual protagonist sense, made revisiting this game for this video quite revelatory. This game marks the end of the good section of this list, and from this point onward, each entry will fall between great and god tier. Number 14. The first Resident Evil movie doesn't commit the same sins its sequels would, thus making its focus on Alice not terrible by any metric. It also doesn't try to even touch the lore or stories of the main games, providing it space to implement its own ideas without coming into conflict with the audience's feelings about these other titles. The Spencer Mansion is there, sure, but the inclusion of Hive, the AI, and Laser Trap all make this film a true standout, and the latter of those would actually become a part of RE4 down the line. If Anderson had continued the films down this track, instead of trying to retrofit the film series to include game elements to the overall detriment of both, this could have been a truly fantastic series of film spin-offs. Resident Evil at the turn of the 21st century was so open in terms of potential directions a film offshoot franchise could go, that it is a shame that they became so tied down by a need to include characters from the games. This always happens with film adaptations when they don't exactly line up with the source material, and this film is actually one of the major reasons I don't consider how well a film handles its source material when initially analyzing them. It's important that films pay proper homage to their literary or game source, sure, but ultimately what matters the most is whether the film is good or not. The first RE movie is a fun film and is one that I would personally call a great adaptation. That being said, even the best movie for the series was never going to stand up to the greatest games in the franchise. Number 13. Revelations has one of the coolest settings in the entire series. A confined and isolated ship makes for a great location, given the series' identity and consistent looping level design. The handheld nature of Revelations, because of the fact that it was made initially as a 3DS game, does stop it from reaching the same heights as proper console games. The hardware constraints of the 3DS just stops the game from being as deep as even the PS1 titles, but this on its own isn't an issue. Some GBA, DS, and 3DS games hold up in the face of their much larger competition, but I've never felt that way about Revelations itself. That being said, Revelations is still an awesome game that does everything it brings to the table extremely well. With some more exploration, deeper gameplay, and or better murder rooms, I would have put Revelations much higher up on the list, and since we live in the RE Remake renaissance right now, perhaps this is something Capcom will revisit in the future. It's a bit lower on my personal remake wishlist though, as the next entry on this list is definitely something I'd like a remake for first. Number 12. Code Veronica is an excellent title held back by a few poor design decisions. This game requires a lot of backtracking, which personally doesn't bother me for a first playthrough, but it does harm repeat runs. Anything that hurts the replayability of an RE game is a massive knock against it, since replay value is one of the key things the series was built on. Dating back to the first game, these titles were always designed with the intent of players rooting through them over and over again. Code Veronica's design makes this somewhat somewhat unappealing in a way that isn't true of other titles. Backtracking is a critique that was definitely levied against RE games during the 2000s, but this is a kairotic critique that was partially affected by how games were moving towards a more linear sort of design during the late 6th generation and nearly the entire 7th generation. Most of the time, it's a critique that doesn't hold much merit, but in Code Veronica's case, I can see why this bothers people, as it has always made me leery of trying to complete it to 100%. This aside, I love the look of Code Veronica. It was the second game in the series to be rendered entirely in 3D, following Survivor by just a handful of days. It does what Survivor tried to do much better, partially because it was made with stronger hardware in mind. Code Veronica also experiments with outside environments to a greater degree than the classic trilogy. Each of those other games often mainly took place in interior locales, with Nemesis being the only real exception. The outside focus does make it feel like you get to experience a whole island with several smaller buildings on it, something that later RE games would replicate, such as RE4's Village Parts. This makes it an important stepping stone for the development of the series, prompting me to reflect positively upon it. Number 11. Part of the reason RE4 Remake is here on the list is because I burnt myself out completing it 100% back in 2023. It took me 70 hours to complete, and I did this without taking a break to play anything else. I'm a variety gamer through and through, so I need to play other things as a type of palate cleanser between different playthroughs, something I did not do in this particular case since I was streaming my entire platinum playthrough at the time. By the end of my time with RE4 Remake, I would like roughly 3.5 of my 7 full playthroughs, but since this is primarily the fault of the way in which I consumed the title, I don't really hold that against it. Any game can become monotonous, frustrating, and/or boring once a player has burned themselves out on it, and when this is the direct result of the way in which the player chose to interact with the media, it truly is the player's fault, not the game nor its design. It's for this reason that when I look back on my time with RE4 Remake, I can appreciate it for what it does amazingly, while also criticizing what it doesn't do well. It's a case where the game's faults are far outweighed by its good parts though, making this a game I'd be excited to experience again at some point down the line. Some of the murder rooms in this title are incredibly enjoyable to experience, something that every action-centered RE game has to do right in order to stand the test of time. When RE4 Remake is hitting, it is hitting hard, which is always a sign of a banger. Number 10. My playthrough of RE5 actually immediately preceded my RE6 one, and my friend Ryan and I thoroughly enjoyed this title together. He had played it many times before, but for me, it was a great first experience, one of which we played on the hardest available difficulty. RE5's worst traits are its inclusion of QTEs and the later chapters that make it feel much more like the third-person cover shooters that were all the craze in the late 2000s. RE5 is likely one of the best co-op experiences I've ever had, and it would be right up there with the co-op experience of the original Halo trilogy, Baldur's Gate 1, 2, and Champions of Norath, and Portal 2. Sheva is my preferred character in the game because I've never liked Chris, and something I'd like to go back to this for is its Mercenaries mode. Stopping after the campaign, this is something I'd say I truly missed out on, and whenever I go through and do an extensive series of videos on this franchise, this is something I'll definitely be diving deep into. Mercenaries is one of the most important RE modes and something that essentially every single game in the franchise should include, and the core gameplay of RE5 facilitates awesome murder rooms, which is something every great Mercenaries mode needs. Number 9. Requiem is the most recent game to release as of the making of this video. This is an odd one because I can actually see this game landing just below Code Veronica in the future on account of some of its later sections. The grace-focused moments in the early hours of the game are some of the best the entire franchise has ever seen, and if the whole game were just that, I would have no choice but to put this in the top 5 at the very least. Both the healthcare facility and basement beneath are excellent to explore, solve, and learn to speedrun, and some of the Leon parts that follow are also quite nice. However, the second half of the game is far lower in terms of overall quality. I don't necessarily dislike the Raccoon City exploration sections with Leon, Nor do I hate the gray stealth sections through the liquor portions of the underground facility. These parts are definitely not as good as what the game began with though. The Leon parts in the second half truly feel like RE4 Remake from Wish at times, having some of the core ideas of that game on display while also missing the point of what makes RE4 Remake so good. Likewise, the underground facility parts are too signposted to make them match the gray sections of the healthcare residents. It sometimes leads to fun moments, such as when the player is able to line up multi-kills on lickers and zombies, but the tension that the RE7 style of game does best just doesn't exist within this part of Requiem at all. In this way, this part of the game lacks the luster of the first half. Now, that may make it seem like I'm down on the game, but I do want to be very clear. Even these sections, despite being worse than the earlier parts, are better than the worst sections in other games by far. Requiem has often been called a nostalgia fest, a critique I can definitely understand, as it does bring back several series ideas. This seems to be more in a reverential capacity than a referential one though, so I don't really agree with the idea that these elements harm the game overall. Some things, like the return of giant spiders, are an absolutely goated plus in the game's favor after all. No, the issue is not the fact that Requiem clearly is trying to unify the gaps between RE7 and RE4 type design philosophies. The issue is that it favors the RE4 style over the much better RE7 type the initial parts of the game embody. The murder room design that makes RE4, 5, and the remake of 4 so fun is just poorer in Requiem, which is why I think this is. If they could have actually made that Raccoon City section a proper advancement of the ideas presented in RE4 Remake, this game as a total package would be much higher up. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on this game though, consider checking out my analysis of it, which I'll leave a link to at the end of the video. Number 8. RE7 saved the series. This is not a hyperbolic statement, as Resident Evil was at its lowest point ever during the RE6 era of the series. Initially, Resident Evil was conceived as being a first-person game, so the fact that they returned to that idea while also taking the series back to its roots is what makes RE7 such a special game in the franchise. Jack Baker is a wonderful pursuer, and the Louisiana manse setting matches the horror tones of the series quite nicely. Resident Evil started out about the infection of residencies, the inversion of what we expect civilization to be. Cities should be safe from catastrophe, and the Raccoon City incident flips this expectation on its head. Likewise, we expect homes to maintain a certain standard of safety as well, which is what the Baker family home subverts. My favorite part of the game is the chainsaw duel boss fight, but beyond this, exploring the Baker residence and solving the puzzle box design of their estate is that classic sort of RE loop that makes the series so good. The worst part of RE7 is the tanker part, but I wouldn't even call this section that bad on repeat playthroughs. It's only bad in the first playthrough because the player doesn't know it's coming, and being blindsided by something like that can really leave a lingering bad taste. That being said, RE7 gives the player lots of reasons to replay it, like Madhouse mode and Chris's DLC campaign. As a total package, RE7 is just one of the best original games in the series, and if it weren't for the fact that the first 4 games in the series are so good, and that their remakes also maintain a high quality bar, it'd be much higher on this list. Number 7. The original Resident Evil Director's Cut is the game that solidified the survival horror genre and Resident Evil's place in gaming godhood. The looping nature of the Spencer Mansion, mines, and research facility beneath are all time-honored bits of level design, further bolstered by an amazing implementation of enemies, puzzles, and horrific elements. It is this part of the list forward where I would say there's not one single part of the campaign I dislike, even if there may be minor quibbles in regards to the gameplay for one entry a bit higher on this list. My favorite part of Director's Cut is after the hunters are introduced for the first time, which foundationally changes the way in which the player interacts with the Spencer Mansion. Areas they thought were safe are now not necessarily so, making the backtracking that happens at this particular section of the campaign feel fresh. Backtracking is not the objectively bad sort of game design many people have presented it as being, as this section of Director's Cut demonstrates the advantages backtracking can bring to a title that utilizes this sort of campaign design in a better way. Director's Cut also has huge spiders, the gigantic snake Yawn, and Neptune's brood of massive sharks, which lines up with the B-tier sci-fi movie trend that was centered on large, genetically modified animals. The B-movie feel of Director's Cut is by intention, and this element of it adds to that sort of ambiance. All of this gives Director's Cut a truly timeless quality to its vibes, making it a true standout both within the survival horror space and the franchise as a whole. Number 6. RE3 Remake is a game that has been often criticized online. This is because of the fact that parts of the original are not present within this game. However, for me, this is not an issue since the game maintains a similar runtime and tonality to the original. Would I have liked the clock tower, the gravedigger, and the player choice elements that were in the original to have also been in the remake? Well, duh, of course I would, but I believe it is important to analyze games based on what they are and not what we wish they were. What RE3 Remake is a solid game, with great level design, fun gameplay, and possibly the most fun completionist loop in the entire franchise. I've not completed every single game to 100%, but of the ones I have, RE3's completionist loop is by far and above the best. This game introduced the completion point system of unlockables, something that would be reused in Village, RE4 Remake, and Requiem, and I would say that this game utilizes this mechanic the best out of all of them. Beyond this, the difficulty progression of RE3 Remake reminds me a lot of boomer shooter or character action game design, where it truly feels like it is the designer's intention for the player to play each difficulty, working themselves up to the point where they are able to beat Inferno without external weapons, like the infinite rocket launcher. This sort of design begs the player to master the game, which is something RE3 Remake does better than every other game in the series, in my opinion. In fact, the dodge mechanic is one of my favorite things about the RE3 Remake, and is a key part of mastering the title. All of that being said, RE3 Remake does lack the overall design chops present in what I would call the top 5 best games in the series. Number 5. RE4 is an all-time classic, and its only flaw is the fact that it has QTEs. This is the minor quibble I alluded to in the director's cut entry, and clearly it is not annoying enough to ruin the game. QTEs always make games worse to some degree, but most of the time RE4 doesn't punish the player too much for failing one of these. Something that is interesting about the discourse around RE4 and its place in the series is how it's often viewed as moving the series away from the tank control games of old, and this is ironic since RE4 actually uses tank controls itself. In fact, tank controls wouldn't leave the series until after RE5. The elimination of the fixed camera angles is the real thing that separates RE4 from the classic period of the series. For me personally, tank controls aren't a bother at all. In fact, for the games that are purposefully designed around them, I actually quite like them. Just like any sort of game design idea, they can be implemented either poorly or excellently, and RE is a series that historically has utilized tank controls to quite great effect, which is exemplified in RE4. The game has some simply excellent murder rooms that make rooting through the game over and over again incredibly fun. Professional playthroughs of the title are especially interesting since it requires a true mastery of ammo conservation, melee maximization, area control, and enemy management. There's a reason that historically RE4 has been viewed as one of the best in the entire franchise, and that's because it is genuinely a fantastic, all-time goated sort of title. Number 4. The original RE Remake is the game that showed what a remake should be. Oftentimes, I think people confuse the terms remaster and remake, treating them as if they are interchangeable and the same. This is not the case, as a remake is when a game is rebuilt from the ground up, whereas a remaster is when a game is either upscaled or otherwise modified slightly in order to get it to run on modern hardware without changing anything of major significance, including graphics. Capcom does remakes in quite a different fashion from every other development studio in gaming history because they will completely change the core level design, game mechanics, and vibe of the game without sacrificing its connection to the original. In this way, Capcom RE remakes feel like great additions to the originals, and it's always frustrating when people act as if they are the same games as the past, or otherwise completely replace the original titles. The reason I'm talking about this here is because this is the one single time on this list where I've placed the remake higher than the original. This does not mean I think the 2002 remake makes Director's Cut not worth playing though, as each is incredible incredibly different from one another, making each foundationally different experiences. This is true of all remakes, but it is even more true when it comes to Capcom RE remakes. The inclusion of the Crimson Heads, the redesigned nature of the Shark section, the Lisa Trevor part, all set the 2002 game adrift from Director's Cut in quite intriguing ways. Spencer Mansion itself has a different layout, making going back and forth between the two games especially interesting. This is likewise true of RE2's remake. Number 3. RE2 Remake is the game that kickstarted Capcom's current remake craze. It's an excellent rendition of RE2 that demonstrates the core ideas of the game to quite great effect. There are some missteps, just like with the RE3 remake though, such as the lack of a zapping system and the fact that Claire and Leon's A-B campaign framework lacks all of the unique touches that made that feature of the original so special. That being said, what I said in regards to RE3 Remake is true here as well. Analyzing what we have is more important than lamenting what we didn't and were never going to get. What we got is a rock-solid title that doesn't really have any weak points. There's subtle differences with how Capcom grants the player resources and puzzle pieces between the A-B runs of Leon and Claire's campaigns that make finishing the game at least 4 times an absolute must. In addition to this, the difficulty modes of each are fun to experience, meaning that when I 100%ed this game in 4 to 5 playthroughs, I never got burnt out, which kind of demonstrates what I mean. The design of the RPD, sewers, and research facility are all excellently done, and really the worst thing about RE2 Remake is the Sherry Orphanage part in Claire's campaign. Even the Ada part in Leon's campaign isn't something I would call bad after the player gets used to her. The major standout in RE2 Remake is Mr. X though. He's a major hurdle for the player to overcome and root around, and I would say he's likely my favorite thing about RE2 Remake's design. It's interesting that in the B campaigns for Leon and Claire, he spawns earlier in the player's process through the RPD, and this is a wrench that truly makes these second campaigns feel different from the A playthroughs. Keeping that in mind, sometimes the classics are the classics for good reason, and my pick for the top 2 games in the franchise require us to once again go back to the 90s. Number 2. Nemesis in the original RE3 is the best version of the pursuer-style enemy Capcom has ever done. He's a true threat all throughout RE3, and he can travel between zones, which is something that not all pursuer-type enemies have been able to do in the series. Raccoon City during its fall is my favorite setting and time period for Resident Evil, and Nemesis does this to quite great effect. I think one of the key things that made people so disappointed with the RE3 remake is that there's some real potential to flesh out Raccoon City and make it something that is truly open in its design to a degree that wasn't possible on the PS1. I'd like this too, but the way Nemesis approaches the design of the city with the hardware constraints of its era is beautiful. Exploring the dilapidated streets and buildings of Raccoon City, the clock tower, the hospital, and the research facility creates this kind of iconic experience that no other game in the series has ever been able to properly replicate. Nemesis is the first game to have a Mercenaries mode too, and while it is rudimentary, it adds a lot of replay value to the game. Nemesis's weakest aspect is that its replay value is lower than most of the best games in the series, but I think it makes up for this by being extremely well designed. Number 1. 1998's RE2 is my favorite game in the series. The dual campaign nature of the game feels intentional and organic in a way that no other game has managed to replicate. The zapping system is a fun inclusion and would be used as a mechanic in some future survival horror games like Fatal Frame 3: The Tormented. The RPD and the research laboratory are both extremely well designed and fun to explore. And this game is where Lickers, a series staple enemy type, are introduced. My first encounter with them was via a PlayStation demo disc, and that moment when the Licker first crawls across the window as the player passes will forever be seared into my mind. The sounds the zombies, players' footfalls, and doors make are all small things that add to the overall atmosphere in the game. It's both hokey and spooky in equal measure. The replay value of this title is among the highest in the series. There's the A-B scenarios for Leon and Claire, the 4th survivor mode, and the Tofu Survivor Challenge as well, all which gives the player more of a reason to revisit the game. The top 9 of this list are all-time honored, truly excellent games, and I could accept any one of them as being someone's de facto pick for the best game in the series. That being said, I'd like to hear what your ranking for RE games would be. Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, consider smashing that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. Hyping this video is the best way to ensure others get the chance to see it, and I'd greatly appreciate the help. This is a variety gaming channel first and foremost, so once I've finished my time with Resident Evil Requiem, a game I plan to release more videos about over the course of the next couple months, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the Super Mario Galaxy games, Mortal Kombat 2, Classic Tomb Raider, and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, alongside a smattering of new and upcoming titles. If any of that piques your interest, stick around. You may like my other and future work, and I release 2 videos weekly. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, dudes!